At the core of narcissistic behavior is a psychological and neurobiological dependency on what clinicians call narcissistic supply. This term refers to the attention, admiration, validation, and emotional energy that narcissists extract from others to maintain their inflated sense of self-worth. From a neurobiological standpoint, receiving narcissistic supply activates the brain's reward circuitry, particularly the mesolimbic dopamine system, which is associated with motivation and reinforcement learning. Every compliment, every emotional reaction, positive or negative, acts as reinforcement, strengthening their behavioral patterns and self-image. In functional terms, narcissists often operate like emotional addicts. They constantly seek stimulation through social dominance, manipulation, or attention-seeking behaviors. The mere act of being observed, admired, or even feared reinforces their internal narrative of superiority. This explains why narcissists often exaggerate accomplishments, interrupt conversations, or provoke conflict. They're attempting to maintain a continuous feedback loop of emotional and psychological reinforcement. Depriving them of this supply isn't just frustrating for them, it destabilizes their internal equilibrium. Behaviorally, they are hypersensitive to anything that interrupts this supply, including indifference, criticism, or being ignored. Research shows that narcissists exhibit heightened activity in the anterior, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex regions associated with social pain when they feel excluded or overlooked. What this means in practical terms is that your withdrawal of emotional engagement or refusal to play into their feedback loop activates a kind of psychological discomfort. Not getting the reaction they want functions as a form of emotional punishment, even if it's done passively. This framework is critical to understand because it shows that narcissists aren't just annoying or arrogant. They are wired to need your attention like oxygen. Their entire social architecture is built on receiving this supply consistently. When you cut off that fuel source intentionally or not, you create a neurochemical imbalance that the narcissist often experiences as an existential threat to their self-concept, setting boundaries. With a narcissist is more than a psychological necessity. It's a form of neurological interruption that disrupts their behavioral patterns. Narcissists are wired to seek control in relationships. This control isn't always overt or aggressive. Often it manifests as subtle manipulation, guilt, tripping, gaslighting, or shifting. Gray rocking is a behavioral tactic that involves becoming emotionally unreactive, neutral, and uninteresting in the presence of a narcissist. At a neurobiological level, this tactic targets the dopamine-driven reward system in the narcissist's brain. Narcissists are constantly scanning their environment for emotional cues, positive or negative, that can be used to validate their inflated self-image or provoke control over others. When you provide an emotional reaction, even a negative one like anger or defensiveness, it activates their reward circuitry, particularly the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, which are linked to motivation and the anticipation of reward. Gray rocking works by starving that system. By maintaining a flat, non-reactive tone, offering minimal eye contact, avoiding emotionally charged language, and giving short, factual responses, you effectively create a psychological dead zone. The narcissist's brain, which thrives on stimulation and emotional feedback, starts to interpret these interactions as barren and unrewarding. Over time, this leads to a form of learned disinterest. From a neuroscience perspective, it's a form of extinction where previously reinforced behaviors are no longer rewarded, leading to a gradual decrease in their frequency. This technique also short. Circ, it's the narcissist's need for control. When emotional responses are absent, their usual tactics, whether it's love bombing, gaslighting, or triangulation, fail to produce the expected outcomes. The unpredictability of your emotional disengagement induces a low-level state of anxiety in them, activating stress-related circuits like the amygdala and hypothalamus. It becomes internally dysregulating for the narcissist, who relies heavily on the reactions of others to maintain a coherent sense of identity and emotional balance. Additionally, gray rocking shifts power in the interaction. By depriving the narcissist of their usual emotional leverage, you create a dynamic where their influence over you weakens. The lack of feedback also denies them the mirror they use to shape their grandiose self-image. Empathy is a core mechanism through which humans connect, co-regulate emotions, and build relational depth. It is also one of the primary tools narcissists exploit to manipulate others. They rely on the empathic responses of those around them to regulate their self-esteem, validate their grandiosity, and orchestrate control. From a neuroscience perspective, this exploitation hinges on the activation of mirror neurons, cells in the brain that allow individuals, narcissists, construct their identity around the perception of others, not internal stability. Their self-worth is largely externalized, hinging on how they are seen, admired, or feared by those in their social environment. This makes reputation their psychological pressure point. When their public image is challenged, especially in calm, factual, and non-emotional ways, it disrupts their internal narrative and triggers a cascade of defense mechanisms. Neurologically, the experience of social threat activates regions like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, both involved in processing emotional pain and social exclusion. These brain areas light up similarly to when we experience physical pain, which highlights how deeply narcissists are affected by even subtle disruptions to their image. Accountability forces a narcissist to reconcile two realities: the inflated persona they project and the observable facts of their behavior. This dissonance often leads to an internal state of cognitive conflict. The brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and moral reasoning, becomes engaged in trying to resolve this inconsistency. For a narcissist, this process is deeply uncomfortable because it demands vulnerability and introspection, two traits they avoid at all costs. Instead, they often react with deflection, blame, shifting, or rage, not out of power but out of neural dysregulation and a perceived threat to their psychological survival. Importantly, the effectiveness of public accountability lies not in shaming but in precision. The more composed and grounded the exposure is, the more powerless the narcissist feels. Their usual tools of manipulation, emotional outbursts, intimidation, or charm, tend to fall flat in the presence of calm, well-articulated truth. Group dynamics also amplify this effect. In front of an audience, even a small one, narcissists become hyper, aware of how others are perceiving them. This heightens the stakes and increases the emotional cost of being exposed or contradicted, leading to internal destabilization and social anxiety.